In essence, BioShock Infinite's narrative takes players on a distorted journey of American history and then concludes that, even in a world of infinite possibilities, there remain constants and variables. The details may change, but, as Noel Ignatieff once said,
there can be no white race without the phenomenon of white supremacy. If you abolish slavery, you abolish.
The entire unfolding of the game was designed specifically to arouse feelings of hatred toward Comstock, the white supremacist effigy, and then reveal to the player that they are, in fact, that very effigy. At which point the player is meant to entertain the idea that, to save the rest of humanity from his sinful nature, he should cease to exist. Now, do I think very many people came away from the game with this interpretation? No, I don't. I think this pretty much went over everyone's head, almost entirely. It was so grotesque, so alien, so hostile, that it simply didn't register on most people's radar. A word that comes to mind here, once again, is chutzpah. On the other hand, of course, Ken Levine inserted a lot of narrative mechanisms for plausible deniability as well. Centris Altus here will invariably focus on how the series supposedly suggests equal fanaticism and guilt on everyone's part, while they ignore that Daisy Fitzroy wasn't drowned in a baptismal font in the end, and Andrew Ryan wasn't nailed to a cross and repeatedly stabbed with a giant syringe by a Jew. To be sure, there was some controversy surrounding the game when it first came out. Much of it centered on the forced baptism, which, ironically, made Christians upset, precisely because forced baptisms actually go against their beliefs. Still, one Christian asserted that BioShock Infinite was actually the most deeply Christian game he had played in recent memory. He goes through some motions about how baptism is about spiritual death and rebirth, while at the same time he completely undermines the idea that there can be meaningful redemption through baptism. He actually ends the article by calling Ken Levine a prophet. Quote, "My own spiritual journey has led me to believe that the mysterious universal that we recklessly refer to as God is far more inclusive than I had ever fathomed, and yet the road to redemption is a road that leads, perhaps, to a type of death. Ken Levine has, in many ways, failed to craft the perfect game, but I believe he has done something even more important. He has spoken as a prophet," unquote. Naturally, as you might imagine, I don't agree with him here, but I do agree with him about something else he stated earlier when acknowledging the game's plot holes and shortcomings. Quote, "But what if it was not about constructing a watertight plot at all? What if the entire game was constructed in order to bring us to a single moment? What would we find in that moment?" Unquote. Well, in my opinion, the game was entirely constructed to bring us to a single moment, and that moment was your death. And no, I don't think it was some kind of spiritual transformation. The game was stating outright that your path to redemption is death because you have no path to redemption. No matter what you choose to do, as Booker DeWitt or Zachary Comstock or the player, the outcome causes others to suffer. And as far as the mechanics, or presentation rather, of this outcome goes, Comstock, that is DeWitt, that is the player, was convinced to voluntarily accept this outcome. Now, with this in mind, consider how many video games have allowed the player to kill the boss with a speech check. Quite a lot, actually.
Villains realizing the error of their ways and killing themselves is a trope that's fairly well known in gaming.
If you entertain the idea for a moment that Ken is in fact deeply motivated by ethno-religious strife, just maybe he's made one of the most genius dunks possible on an unsuspecting audience. Perhaps he's built an entire game around the very idea of speech checking to death the person whom he views as the enemy. That is, you. And if you think I'm batshit crazy for positing this, remember just how meta people consider his games. Now, I know that some of the doubters might feel inclined to highlight here that DeWitt is actually alive in a post-credits scene, and that he wanders into Anna's nursery before a final cut to black. The idea here, potentially being that all the variations of Elizabeth having murdered DeWitt at the baptismal font have now somehow sent DeWitt back in time to a point where he can make all of the right decisions. It's somewhat tempting, but the game's DLC, Burial at Sea, while also full of plot holes, nevertheless cancels this out and drives home once again the idea that there is no path to redemption for DeWitt or Elizabeth. Burial at Sea is divided into 2 episodes. In the first, you play as an iteration of Comstock, who had accidentally killed DeWitt's baby Anna when the Lutece portal collapsed around her head and decapitated her. A guilt-ridden Comstock, that is, DeWitt, then once again tries to flee the consequences of his actions. Using the Lutece device, he travels to Rapture's universe, where he can forget his past and reassume his identity as Booker DeWitt, the drunk, gambling addict detective. Now, of course, just as was the case with the main game, the player doesn't know any of this at the start of the DLC. So when another iteration of Elizabeth shows up and hires DeWitt to find a missing girl named Sally, it's all a bit confusing. Both DeWitt and Elizabeth seem entirely unaware of their previous relationship as father and daughter, which is strange because her physical presentation is even more sexually caricatured than it was before. The audience now knows about their father-daughter relationship, yet rather than dial back her sex appeal, the developers chose to dial it up, although Elizabeth's head is literally almost the size of her upper body, which suggests childlike proportions, so that's also strange. Long story short, you find Sally in Frank Fontaine's department store, which Andrew Ryan had sunk to the bottom of the sea, thereby trapping Fontaine and his minions. Unfortunately, Sally has already been turned into a little sister by this point.
Don't, please, don't. I'm here. I just want to take you home. I just want you to stop. You're back.
You're hurting her.
Come with
She's
me.
not your child.
She is mine.
Let her go. Let her go.
She's mine. Closing. Shut it down. Shut down the machine.
You've got to pull her through.
Shut down the machine.
No, she's not through.
Shut it down.
No.
I remember all of it. That poor child.
She wasn't yours, Comstock. No. I wasn't.
No.
Yet you had to have me, didn't you?
No, this isn't right.
And the guilt was too much.
You turned to us to solve your problem.
To provide a place to go where you might forget.
Where there never was an Anna in the first place.
Comstock was never one to own up to his errors, was he, brother?
Never comfortable with the choices he made.
Always seeking someone else's life to claim as his own.
Elizabeth. Child. I am so sorry.
No, you're not. But you're about to be.
What's interesting here is how the Luteces accuse Comstock of continuously seeking someone else's life to claim as his own, because this doesn't make sense given the context. Comstock was DeWitt before he became Comstock, so all he had really done here was assume his former identity. Once again, I have the distinct impression that Ken Levine is projecting something. Regardless, episode 1 ends here, with DeWitt once again facing the consequences of his past. Episode 2 then sets its sights on Elizabeth, focusing on her naivety and questioning her innocence. Since DeWitt is now dead, you play as Elizabeth. You start off in a dreamlike state of Paris. The sequence is perhaps the strongest caricature of the entire series. It's almost comical, but that's somewhat the point. In her dream, Elizabeth is the center of everyone's attention, which suggests self-centeredness in addition to naivety. At one point, Elizabeth asks a shopkeeper about a book called The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. Then Elizabeth comes across a man who posits the question, the bird or the cage, and then he adds, why not both? From here, Elizabeth spots and chases after the little girl Sally, who suddenly appears with a red balloon.
Sally!
As she does so, Paris becomes dark and macabre. Now, Sally's red balloon is most likely a reference to the 1956 French classic Le Ballon Rouge, which is about childhood innocence. Here's what one of Ken Levine's co-ethnics, Philip Kennicott, had to say about the film in the Washington Post. Quote, Lamourisse's Paris is basically photographer Eugene Aget's glistening and empty city peopled by characters straight out of the old Madeline children's books. It doesn't exist. It didn't exist in 1956, and it probably never existed, except in carefully constructed French fantasies. And Lamourisse's vision of peasant life in the south of France and the Camargue never existed either. These films take place in a world of lies, unquote. Note here the consistency with which Philip Kennicott's views of idyllic Paris align with Ken Levine's views of idyllic America. Both men argue that each society never really actually quite existed.
It is the memory of America that people think existed that never really actually quite existed.
Kennicott continues, quote, Innocent lies? Not necessarily. The Red Balloon may be the most seamless fusion of capitalism and Christianity ever put on a film. A young boy invests in a red balloon, the love of which places him on the outside of society. The balloon is hunted down and killed on a barren hilltop, think Calvary, by a mob of cruel boys. The ending, a bizarre emotional sucker punch, is straight out of the New Testament, unquote. Indeed, if you've ever seen the film, the red balloon is killed by a gang of children, and then all the balloons in Paris suddenly gain consciousness and fly across the city to comfort the young boy, who then grabs hold and floats off into the sky. But is this really about salvation through Jesus Christ? Maybe, but probably not. It probably has more to do with a child's need for magic and joy in post-war France. I certainly don't think the focus here was on the Jewish role in the events at Calvary, yet that is precisely what Philip Kennicott saw. Now, viewers might be confused here as to why I'm bringing all this up. Well, it's to highlight that very often, where we see something beautiful and innocent, others see something dark and sinister. Now, returning to Bioshock Infinite's DLC, Burial at Sea, by the end, Elizabeth's faults have inadvertently brought about the very events leading to the first game. In her efforts to save Sally, she ends up helping Frank Fontaine get back to Rapture and gain access to his ace in the hole. Then Fontaine beats and leaves her for dead. Now, due to a plot device, Elizabeth had lost her ability to see behind all the doors into infinite realities. But in her last moments, she regains this ability. And what does she see? She sees the original game's protagonist, Jack, now rendered into an almost messianic figure who will save Rapture from Frank Fontaine. Jack, Andrew Ryan's son, is the culmination of a series of tragic events, a triumph over a seemingly endless cycle of oppression, brought about by a guilt-ridden white nationalist and his naive daughter. Their circle, however, has been broken, and eventually the inhabitants of Rapture will be able to venture out into the world absent the fear of future oppression. Now, taking into account the very parallels that Ken Levine has himself drawn between Rapture and the State of Israel, I am tempted hereby to conclude that for him, the only reason the State of Israel needs to exist is because white people exist. Basically, Ken believes that the world will be a better place once my people are gone. This is ironic considering what Cody Klein, a fellow Jew, stated in a Kotaku article about Andrew Ryan's motivations. Quote, like many Jews, he felt like his will had been stripped away, like his world had been destroyed by people who think the world would be better off without people like him. Unquote. Now, even after becoming wildly successful in white America, Ken Levine still viewed white America as fundamentally at odds with his identity. In Bioshock 1, he literally asked, in what country was there a place for people like him? And then he went on to condemn the very idea that there be a place in a country for people like me, for people like you, for people like us.
For the outside world, it was almost incredible to see how all the haggling around the budget crisis developed last year. What does it say about American policies? I mean, is it as crazy as it looks?
Yes, it is. Actually, crazier than I think is you will easily see, because the press has a hard time reporting on it as just how crazy it is. Now, I do think that this is not a permanent condition. The craziness really comes from almost more from cultural, ethnic issues than anything else, because you have a lot of the real craziness comes, if you like, from rural white Americans who feel that they're losing their country, they're losing ownership of the country. And they're right. I mean, we are becoming more diverse, more multicultural, and they are, in the end, they are not the future. In the end, the power they still have will go away, but it's a very difficult time until then. So the future is Mayor de Blasio of New York, but Ted Cruz of Texas is still out there with the ability to do a lot of damage.